There, Year 10, and welcome to our first of the video lectures in the timber industry unit. When we're looking at the timber industry, there are a couple of different things that we need to look at. Some of those things include how a tree grows. Some of them include how a tree is then converted into solid wood pieces that can be used in our workshops and for furniture making. How the timber industry impacts on the environment, and more specifically around the use of manufactured boards. And then we're also going to have a look at careers in the timber industry as well. For today, we're specifically looking at tree growth and structure. There are two videos to watch on tree growth and structure because there's quite a lot to go through when we're thinking about it. And by the end of this particular video, we're hoping that you understand how the seasons of summer and winter wood impact on wood structure, on the parts of a tree. You hopefully will know one example of a hardwood and one example of a softwood. You'll know what both a hardwood and a softwood are. And you'll understand that difference between what we call a hard and a softwood. And then we've got a little quiz that we've put together on the structure and the growth of trees we'd like you to respond to. So let's get started right at the beginning. Timber grows on trees. Trees are timber. Trees are a natural resource. They can be regrown. So if you have seeds, you can grow a tree. And then once they reach their full maturity, we can cut them down and convert them into timber. Trees store carbon, which is really good for the environment. They can be sustainable in the way that we use our timber, in the sense that timber products can often be recycled, and in the sense that we can also plant trees to meet the requirements that we have around the timber use for purposes of furniture making and construction and all of those sorts of things. Now, when we think about our products and we think about what sorts of timber we are going to use, some of the things that we think about are, what is the species of timber? It's like, what is the specific tree that we are using to get the wood that we need? Because each different type of tree, so if I think of a pine tree or an apple tree or a cedar tree, for example, they all have an individually different type of wood, and we call those species, just like you do in the animal kingdom for all the different types of animals. And each species of timber has different characteristics and features: colors, tightness of the grain, hardness, durability, strength, etc. That impacts on the type of timber that we pick for each of the products that we are making. Now, when we're at school, we pick a cheap timber that's sustainable because we're practicing our timber skills. When you work in the furniture industry, there's a lot more thought that goes into the process of picking timbers, because you have to build your furniture to meet what the client needs, and the color of the wood needs to match the client's house, and there's a whole heap of stuff to think about. We also need to think about the way that the timber that we are using for our projects is processed. We think about the way that it's seasoned, and you'll learn a little bit more about seasoning later on, and also about any treatments that may have happened to protect the timber from future damage. So there's a bit of an overview about trees, and we'll now get started on how trees grow. So if we think about trees, we'll start with just the trunk. The growth of the tree trunk happens up and outwards. What that means is the tip of the tree, right at the top, is the freshest, and the timber on the outside of the trunk is the freshest. If you were to get a tree and you were to put a nail in that tree today at your eye level, after 50 years the nail would be at the same height, because that particular part of the tree hasn't pushed up out of the ground. Instead, the part of the tree that's growing is above that nail. So that's the way you've got to think about it. All the timber, as it grows on the outside of the wood. So what we're saying here is, if we were to look at a tree trunk, we've obviously got bark that protects the outside of the tree, but just below the bark is the very freshest, the youngest part of that tree. And then as we find our way to the very center of the tree trunk is where you find the oldest wood. Trees grow towards the light, so that is towards the sun. So if you were living on a street that is quite a steep hill, your tree will be growing still upwards towards the sun, and it'll probably be leaning a little bit north as it obviously tries to connect with the sun. The trunk, generally speaking, is quite straight. Trees look like they might be growing crooked, but it's usually that the tree is growing straight against a crooked ground. Generally speaking, if we're talking about big forests, really dense forests, then the trees grow quite tall as they try to push past the height of the other trees. So they grow quite tall and quite straight in the forests. And because the branches down the bottom are covered by a heavy canopy in like a rainforest, for example, then the lower branches tend to die and fall off the tree and stop growing. So all of the leaves are at the top of the tree where they are able to get to light. As these branches die, they leave small knots in the wood. Now, knots are a defect that we'll learn about later, but they can also be a feature. The largest branches will usually be at the top of the tree as the tree strengthens them because of the light. And once they've found its way to the top of the tree, they continue to grow. The same tree, so if I had two trees and they were grown at the same time, a tree that was in an open paddock, like in the middle of a farm or in the middle of our oval, for example, would be a very different shape to a tree growing in a forest. A tree growing in a forest, very tall, very skinny, lots of branches at the top. A tree growing in the middle of our oval where there's no other trees around it, if it's just grass around, for example, would grow to be almost like a ball shape where there's lots of branches at all different parts of the tree, low down and high up, and creating quite a round shape. The tree will be very wide, very large branches, probably even the same thickness as the main trunk. Forest trees, however, quite thin, okay, but very tall. Now, how do these trees actually grow? So we start with, we've got a sapling. A sapling is a very small twig, okay? It's basically the start of a tree, a little seedling almost. The center of this tree that we're going to have begins with the sapling. All the new wood grows around that, and it gets thicker and thicker as it develops its trunk, and it gets taller and taller as it builds new wood towards the light. Once the tree has finished growing, this original sapling, or this original little twig, is locked inside of the tree trunk, and it's quite a dark coloured piece of timber, and we call that the pith. Okay, we call that the pith. When we then think about a tree structure, we have a whole heap of different layers. The pith becomes the very center of the tree, and all the new wood starts to grow on the outside. We start with this thing called the cambium layer. Now, the cambium layer is where all the fresh wood is growing, and around the outside of the cambium layer is where the bark goes. Now, every year new bark is made for the tree, so your bark on a tree actually falls off every single year and is replaced. Okay? That bark is there to protect the moisture in the tree. It's also to protect that new wood from any damage. Okay, so remember, the tree starts in the center and grows outwards, and it grows upwards. Now, that sapling, as the tree begins to grow, okay, the sapling then starts, once that cambium layer becomes wood and no longer just a bunch of cells and actually becomes wood, then it starts to become a more solid timber. We call that sapwood. Sapwood is the newest wood, and it's on the outside of the tree. It's usually about 1 to 3 centimeters, and this is the part of the tree that gets all the nutrients from the roots, okay, that have been collected from the soil and from the water, and they transfer all of those nutrients up to the leaves. So those cells in the sapwood are open and able to transfer nutrients up and down the tree. When the sapwood gets a little bit older and it joins the center of the tree, it becomes what's known as hardwood. Now, this heartwood is very old wood. It's not the fresh young wood that's just growing on the outside of the tree. It's the older of the wood. And the way that we characterize the heartwood is that the cells have closed, so there's no longer that ability for all the nutrients to be transferred from the roots to the leaves. This is where the tree stores a whole heap of waste, okay, what we call carbon. So if we think of all of the global warming, sorts of things, and we talk about all the extra carbon we have in the atmosphere and how we get rid of it. The reason everyone says to grow trees is because trees actually store carbon inside of them as they grow. So if I'm looking at this tree trunk diagram on the screen right now, what I'm actually having is this dark green section is the pith. That's the original twig that started the growth of the tree. Then we have this yellowy, orangey brown sort of color. That's the heartwood. This is the tree that's in the timber in the center of the tree wrapped around that pith. It's very old wood and it can't transfer nutrients because it's basically filled up and storing all of the carbon that the tree has collected from the atmosphere. Then on the outside of that, there's this lighter yellowy color. This is the sapwood, so this is the fresher tree, okay, the fresher wood that's been growing. You've then got that thin green layer. That thin green layer is that cambium layer where the fresh wood is being developed from cells as they grow on the tree. Then you've got this brown color, which is the bark protecting the tree. Now, you'll see there I've now got these arrows around the light yellow section. This is coming from the sapwood as the nutrients are transported up the tree and therefore help the tree to grow upwards. This slide shows that even more wood has been laid down on the outside, and the previous sapwood has now become heartwood, and now there is new sapwood. The bark has peeled off and is replaced by new bark on the outside. And so we still have a pith, we still have heartwood, we still have sapwood, and the cambium layer is continuing to grow with the bark around the outside. This is a little bit of another diagram to help you understand the structure of a trunk. So if I was to take a bit of a slice out of a tree, this is what you'd expect to see. So you should be able to see here, right in the center, there's a very dark spot. We call that, like I said, the pith. This is that original twig that started the tree. It's running through the very center of the tree. Wrapped around that is the heart of the tree, the heartwood. This is sapwood that has clogged up with resins, gums, and all the other sorts of waste, including carbon, all filled up in the center of the tree here. This wood is definitely dead and can't transfer nutrients anymore. We've then got this lighter colored timber, which is the sapwood. This is living wood. Okay, it's been alive and it's starting to die, but it hasn't yet fully clogged up. This part of the timber, this sapwood, is still able to transfer those nutrients up and down from the roots to the leaves. Okay, it stores the nutrients, transfers them up and down the tree, helps the tree to grow. Around that, we have that cambium layer. It's that really thin layer where the new tree is growing from. And we've now got this new layer we're going to mention. Now, this is the phloem. This is a thin layer that helps to collect the sugars and all the growth hormones from the leaves and transfer them back to the other parts of the tree. So it transfers nutrients back into the center of the tree. Your bark, as you know, helps to protect the tree, protects it from water damage, protects it from mechanical damage, from the hot temperatures, from the cold temperatures, all of those sorts of things, and stops these two parts, the phloem and the cambium layer, from drying out. These parts here are quite wet on a tree. So if you were to cut a tree branch open, sometimes you can see a little bit of sap has sort of leaked out a little bit. That's usually coming from these two layers. Some of the other parts that you're going to see here are the growth rings. Now the growth rings are those big circles you can see wrapping around the center of the tree. Each growth ring indicates the age of the tree, and I'll talk about that more on the next slide. And then we've also got these rays. Now these rays, you'll see them, they go from the center, they point all the way out. They help to transfer nutrients from the outside of the tree and ones that might need to be stored all the way back into the center. So rays are a great way for the tree to transfer nutrients from the outside to the inside of the tree and back. Okay? The growth rings show us different colors in the timber to help us understand how old the tree is. So this is what growth rings look like. Growth rings usually have a light part and a dark part. That's what we would expect in a growth ring. The light part, is the early wood. This is the timber that is grown at the start of the growing season. So if you think of the seasons in the year, summer, autumn, winter, spring, I'm going to start with spring. Spring is when all of the trees start to grow. This is when the early wood appears. If you have had a very wet winter where it's rained a lot in winter, as soon as the tree starts to grow in spring, there is a rapid growth happening. These cells in the tree grow really fast and are really light in coloured because of how fast they're growing. Then the tree continues to sort of grow through summer, and then autumn comes and the tree slows down. When it slows down in that autumn period, it becomes late wood. And late wood is a lot darker in colour because the tree is slowing down, sorry. The amount of growth slows down, so we have a lot of growth happening in spring and the start of summer, and then once we get to autumn, the amount of growth slows down. And as a result, when we're looking at our growth rings, if you look here in 1984 on this example, the early wood is quite light in colour and you'll see it's quite wide. The late wood in the growth ring is really dark in colour, it's really compacted, it's really thick cells, and it's only a very short period. Okay? What that means is if your tree grows in spring, okay, so I start here, the tree grows in spring through to summer, through into autumn, and then it stops growing in winter. In winter, the trees go into hibernation, they no longer grow. Okay, that's the general life cycle of the tree during the seasons. So if we know that there are light sections for spring and dark sections for summer, autumn, what we can do is we could actually count how many dark lines there are going around the tree, how many dark growth rings there are, and we could count how many autumns this tree has gone through to work out how old it is. Okay? So if I was looking at this tree at the top here, you can see there's probably about 50 or so dark rings around there if we were to count them. So this tree would be approximately 50 years old. So that's what we talk about, being able to work out how old a tree is just by counting the growth rings. Now, one thing to keep in mind is sometimes, like this year for example, right at the start of autumn when the tree should have been slowing down, we suddenly got a whole heap of rain in Sydney, and then we got some really hot weather. Now what happens there is that you sometimes get this little thin line like you'd see in 1982 and in 1871, where there are little sections where the tree started rapidly growing again because the tree thought it was spring. It had a heap of water and it had a heap of heat, so it started growing again. And then if it's anything like today where it suddenly gets really cold and winter hits, the tree stops growing. Okay? So you can sometimes see these little variations where you see that there was a late growing season for the tree where it got a little bit of extra growth and then it actually went into the hibernation mode officially. Okay? So let's move on. That's how a tree grows. We now have to make the distinction between two different things. There are hardwoods and there are softwoods. Hardwoods, we basically work out a hardwood based on a few different features. So you should be able to go outside your house right now, pick any tree in the street, and in a moment you'll be able to tell me if it's a hardwood or a softwood. We'll start with the first characteristic of a hardwood. A hardwood has a leaf. Okay? We call them a broadleaf. A leaf that isn't just a little needle, it's a wide leaf, and you can see it's got the little veins in it, it's got like the fleshy part. These are broadleafs. So if you go outside your house and you've got a gum tree, this would be considered a broadleaf. Therefore, the gum tree outside your house is going to be a hardwood. The other thing that we keep in mind about hardwoods is they are usually, not always, but they are usually deciduous. What this means is that during autumn, the leaves fall off the tree. So if you have leaves falling off your tree outside, like let's say you've got a maple tree outside, for example, that means it's deciduous, therefore it is probably going to be a hardwood. So there's two ways to tell. The third way to tell if your tree is a hardwood is it might grow fruit. If your tree grows a fruit like an apple, like a mango, like a avocado, like an orange, a lemon, a lime, then it is a hardwood. If your tree has a nut, okay, where your seed, the seed for the tree, is inside of a really hard shell like a nut, like an acorn, then your tree is a hardwood. And they're the main ways that people are able to tell if a tree outside is a hardwood or a softwood. Now, some of the other ways scientifically, if we're looking at it, hardwoods grow a lot slower. They take a lot longer to grow. They usually have darker timber because their grain is close together, and that's because they are slow growing. And we call them porous. Now, porous is a term that we use to describe a hardwood, but it's something you would only be able to see if you were looking at the cell under a microscope. This is a bit of a look of what a cell looks like in a hardwood. You can see there's this enormous circle in the center. We call this a pore or a vessel, and then there are these smaller ones patterned all around it. Now in a hardwood, there is a single large one, and the rest of them are fairly well organized and fairly consistently sized. That main one there, that main vessel, is used to help to transfer nutrients around the tree. Moving along to a softwood. A softwood looks very different. Instead of having a leaf, a softwood has a needle. Now, what I mean by that, if you look outside and you've got a pine tree like this one here, I know it looks like it's got broad leaves, but when you look at it, there's a little stem down the center of the leaf, and then there are little needles or little spines that stick out. There's no soft, fleshy part of the tree, just the hard, veiny parts. If you have a tree outside that's got needles like this, it is most likely going to be a softwood. Softwoods usually don't lose their leaves. So in autumn, the leaves do not fall off a softwood usually, which makes them called evergreen. So instead of being deciduous like a hardwood where the leaves fall off in winter and autumn, an evergreen stays green forever, okay, at all times. Now for a softwood, the seeds are not inside a piece of fruit, and they are not inside of a nut shell. They're usually inside of a cone. Now a cone is a small, usually a hard shell that opens up and the seeds drop out. Okay? The difference between a cone and a nut, for example, the nut has to be cracked open by an animal or by a human, whereas a cone opens on its own to release the seeds so that the tree can have children effectively. These trees grow very, very fast, much faster than a hardwood, which means they are really good for using when making furniture. Their grain is much wider, which makes them lighter because they grow so fast, and they are non-porous. So if we look at this cell structure up here, we can see that there is no large pore. There's just lots of single veins going up, or tracheids as they are called, and it's a fairly structured cell type. Now if we go to some examples here, I'm going to go back to hardwood. An example would be an oak tree as a hardwood because oak has leaves, and an example of a softwood would be pine because a pine has needles, not leaves. That then is the end of today's video. Now, what I would like you to do is to make sure that you've written down some notes. You should have some notes about what is a hardwood, what is a softwood, how does a tree grow, and what are the different parts of a tree trunk. And then at the end of this video, there's a little quiz that we've put together to ask you some questions to make sure you have understood and learnt something new today. I hope that one's been really helpful for you, and I look forward to seeing you back at school.